Let me point out one little irony in the domestic political battles over global warming policies. We all know this stuff is pushed by climate evangelists, people whose zealotry over this one issue seems to trump every other issue or consideration. Think Zali Steggall, Adam Bandt or even Greta Thunberg for that matter. All rational consideration seems to be pushed aside to focus on rampant climate alarmism. Now, one of these climate activists is Simon Holmes a court. He's a renewable energy investor and advocate who pushes his arguments obsessively on Twitter. Fair enough. And he's also supported climate activist political candidates, independents looking to unseat sitting MPs, Liberals mainly, and he's promising to back more of them at the next election. Again, good on him. It's a free world. Argue your case and put your money where your mouth is. But the irony here is that Holmes a Court is, of course, the son of the late Robert Holmes a Court, Australia's first billionaire, who made much of his fortune from mining and resources. Bell Resources was involved in oil, gas and mining, and of course it was part of all that wealth that has benefited Simon Holmes a Court through his privileged upbringing and his inheritance. Of course it doesn't matter where he got his money from, he's entitled to spend it as he likes. But it's more than a little ironic, isn't it, that a resources fortune derived in large part from fossil fuels is at least in part now being used to try and force other investors, workers and customers away from that very same industry sector. And isn't it strange how some of the most active climate change evangelists are wealthy beyond our comprehension? Climate action seems to be a popular hobby for the rich. I want to focus now on the Snowy Hydro 2.0 scheme. Of course, very much a hobby horse of former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, but it's already underway. A couple of experts here want to pick some holes in that project. I'm joined by Ted Woodley, who's the former Chief Executive of Energy Australia. Good to see you, Ted. And I'm joined in Melbourne by Associate Professor Bruce Mountain, who's the Director of the Victorian Energy Policy Centre at the Victoria University. Thanks for joining us, Bruce. Let me start with you, Ted. Now, work has already started on the preliminary work inside the Snowy Mountains, the Kosciuszko National Park, to get Snowy Hydro 2.0 in place. Drilling tunnels so water can be pumped up into a dam, stored to create extra hydroelectricity when you need it, when we need it. Explain to us how it uses more energy than it actually provides.
Well, there's no such thing as a perpetual motion machine, so you need more energy to pump up the hill than you get when the energy comes back down the hill. And in Snowy 2.0's case, you're talking about losses of around 25% in that cyclic process.
Because they're going to pump this, in this case, they're going to be pumping the water 27 kilometres uphill to have it come back down when they need it. But the argument is, of course, you pump it uphill when the energy is cheap, when there's plenty around. Maybe it's night time and there's a lot of wind turbines giving you some energy for free, and then you let it come down and get the hydro at a higher cost, at a higher price when you need it.
Yeah, well, that's the principle of pumped hydro systems.
Is it going to work though?
When it's cheap, and you generate when it's expensive. But I think you just mentioned one of the key facts of this project and why it is more inefficient than any other pumped hydro system, and that's the fact that it's 27 kilometres between its upper and lower reservoir. We've researched pumped hydro systems throughout the world, and we can find no pumped hydro system anywhere with anything like that distance between its two reservoirs. Normally it's within a kilometre or two. Tumut 3, which is the existing pumped hydro system in the Snowy Mountains, is 500 metres between the two reservoirs.
So you pump it further, you're going to use more energy before...
Water friction losses are higher, but as well as that, it's going to cost you more.
Yep.
You've got to drill that hole, and then you've got to dispose of all of that waste. And in this case, that disposed material, some of which has asbestos in it, and some of which has acid-forming rocks in it, is going to be dumped within the park. But 2/3 of it is going to be dumped within Snowy Hydro's own reservoirs.
So it's going to create a lot of waste, and that's an issue for the national park. Let's get back to the economics of this. Bruce, tell us about the cost of this scheme. It's early days, and the work isn't fully underway. If it goes ahead, what will it cost, and would it be commercially viable? Would private investors back a scheme like this, or is this something that's completely reliant on taxpayers' subsidies?
Okay, perhaps I'll start with the last question first. There is no ways at all that the private sector would go anywhere near this project because of its huge tunnel, huge height and size, and the likely income it'll get and the cost of pumping water. All the sums we've done show that there's just no ways it'll get back its costs. So, but for government funding, this project wouldn't happen. What
do you think the total cost will be? Because there's some conjecture.
Yeah.
I've heard figures of over $4 billion, and others suggest perhaps 10.
Well, they have let a contract just for part of the cost at $5.1 billion, and there's another whole lot of costs to come. That's just the cost of the plant. The cost of the transmission hasn't been established, certainly of the whole length yet. It'll be the biggest transmission project in the history of the national electricity market. We've worked on a figure of $10 billion as all up, but as time goes by, I think that's likely to be underestimate. I think it could well be a lot more.
Will it have would it put downward pressure on electricity prices, though? The effect of this scheme?
No, and their own modelling shows that it won't. So, though it has been claimed several times in press releases by the Minister, by the Chief Executive of the company, that it'll put prices down, their own modelling shows that that's not the case. And our own thinking is there's just no chance of it. It incurs a whole lot of expense to operate. That money has to be paid. And I think there's no chance it'll put, they have every good reason to put forward modelling that shows it, and their own modelling doesn't.
Ted, let's talk about other alternatives. Of course, we all know that you could invest in solar and wind, in gas or coal-fired generation. But if hydro was the plan, especially because it's emissions-free, would there be other opportunities across the Eastern Divide where you could actually put in new dams, store additional water and create hydroelectricity? Would that be cheaper, more efficient or more beneficial than this sort of pumped hydro storage plan?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that in this case, it's not clean power that's going into the pumps. For the next 10 years or more, it'll actually be coal-fired electricity that goes into the pump. So
that's stored in water, but it gets up there thanks to coal-fired
water
power.
Is the medium, but coal-fired generation is what's going to be used to pump the electricity, to pump the water. Within the Snowy scheme itself, we've come up with a number of other alternatives that aren't quite as big as Snowy 2, but are far cheaper. They don't involve the extra transmission we're talking about, and almost no environmental impact. So even within the Snowy scheme itself, there are alternatives. Outside the Snowy scheme, within New South Wales, the New South Wales government put out a roadmap a year ago and came up with thousands of potential sites for pumped hydro. Now, I would suggest that most of those are probably not going to be economic or not environmentally attractive, but there are many, many opportunities for other pumped hydro systems.
You might start something where smaller, perhaps, before going for this.
Well, this is so lumpy. It's 2,000 megawatts. When it was announced it was going to take 4 years to build, that's 2021. The contract that Bruce just referred to is for 8 years, so we're talking about the middle of this decade, if then, and it's 2,000 megawatts in one lump. It's far better to have smaller amounts coming on stream as they're required. The other thing that's been demonstrated just recently is the AEMO forecast, that's the Australian Energy Market Operator, show that Snowy 2 actually won't be needed till 2029 or its equivalent. So it's going to be built, if it's on time, which we would doubt, but if it was built in 2025, it's largely going to be idle for its first 4 or 5 years of existence.
We shall see. A lot more to happen in this energy space. So thanks so much for joining us, Ted. I appreciate it, and thanks to Bruce Mountain too, joining us from Melbourne.